This is the new series. I'm here to help you make sense of the most important issues of our time. And what could be more important right now than understanding the dark side of artificial intelligence? In today's episode, we're talking about Karen Hao's brilliant book, Tech Power, Control, The New Digital Empire. She's one of the world's leading experts on AI, and in this book, she exposes how big tech companies are centralizing AI development in their own hands. So let's dive in. Karen, thanks so much for being with us today. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you for having me. So, in your book, you talk about how just a handful of large tech companies are creating most of the artificial intelligence that will shape our future. Why does this concentration of power trouble you? Well, this concentration of power is troubling because it gives such extraordinary ability to these few companies and their leaders to shape not only our commercial and economic life, but also our political life in ways that I think we are really not appreciating. I mean, if we were to wake up tomorrow and find today we're talking about the dark side of AI with Karen Hao, a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter who covers artificial intelligence and its impact on society at large. She is currently working on a book about the quiet takeover of AI by big tech giants like Microsoft and Google. And her recent work has exposed some really scary stuff about what these companies are doing behind closed doors. So today we are going to get into how these massive companies are taking control of AI, how that control translates into political power, and then also how these algorithms are going to end up hurting most people while only helping out a select few. So let's get into it. So there is this idea that AI is going to be this neutral technology that is just going to benefit everybody. But your reporting suggests that actually this is not going to be the case. Yeah, so I think that's right. I think if we look back over the last 30 or 40 years, there's this pattern where every time there's a new technology that comes around, there is this sort of utopian promise of how it is going to transform our lives for the better. So we think about the internet, we think about mobile phones, we think about social media. There's always this promise of greater connectivity, greater efficiency, greater democracy, greater transparency, but we almost always end up with something different. And we end up with a highly centralized technology that ends up putting power into the hands of very few. And so when we think about AI, which is an incredibly powerful technology that has the ability to basically automate many aspects of our lives from how we work to how we relate to each other, there's no reason to believe that this time is going to be any different. And in fact, there are very good reasons to believe that I will follow this same trajectory and that it will end up being a technology that benefits a very small number of people while everyone else kind of bears the brunt of its negative consequences. Now, one thing that I found really interesting in your reporting is this idea that big tech companies are not only creating these systems, they're also heavily influencing the governments that are supposed to be regulating them. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Yeah, absolutely. So as I've been reporting this book, what I've really been struck by is how even though AI is something that affects all of us, it's something that's largely out of our control. And one way that manifests is that there are these giant companies that have basically figured out how to build AI systems that work in ways that benefit them. And then those companies have so much power because they control the technology. They're able to influence the governments that are supposed to be regulating them. And that means that we have this situation where the fox is guarding the hen house. And so one of the things that I write about in my book is how companies like Microsoft and Google have spent decades basically cultivating relationships with policymakers in Washington, D.C. and in various state capitals across the country. And they've cultivated these relationships in a way that gives them access to people who make decisions about how AI is going to be regulated. And what they've been able to do is basically shape the regulatory environment in a way that favors them. For example, there was this opportunity a few years ago where Congress could have passed legislation that would have required companies to disclose when they were using AI to automate jobs. This was an opportunity to basically shine a light on the use of AI in the economy and to give workers a chance to organize and advocate for themselves against these technologies. But in the end, nothing came of that because these tech companies lobbied hard enough to make sure that didn't happen. And so we are left in this place where they can deploy AI in ways that benefit them and we don't even know it is happening. That's kind of crazy. It is like the Mark Zuckerberg quote, "Unregulation is just another word for do-ent-f with us." Right. Yeah, I think it's worse than that actually. I think it's less that they're saying, hey, don't F with us, and more that they're saying, we're gonna F with you unless you F with us. And so I think it is not just that they are lobbying these lawmakers to pass laws that benefit them. I think it's also that they're threatening lawmakers with the prospect of losing their jobs, losing their industries unless they go along with what they want. I guess that raises the question of what exactly makes these companies so powerful in the first place. Yeah, well, I think one part of it is that they're just really rich, right? Like these are companies that have billions and billions of dollars that they can spend on hiring lobbyists, on funding research, on building the infrastructure necessary to deploy AI. But I think another part of it is that they've been at this for a really long time. So they have a head start that basically no other company has. For example, Google's parent company, Alphabet, has a research lab dedicated to AI that's been around for 20 years. 20 years ago, I was still considered a relatively fringe field. Most people thought it would be decades or centuries away. And yet, Google had the foresight to invest in this technology early. And now they have the benefit of 2 decades of research, of development, of experimentation that no other company has. And so they're able to move faster, they're able to scale bigger, and they're able to produce results that are much more sophisticated than anybody else. And that gives them an enormous advantage, not just in terms of the products that they are able to bring to market, but also in terms of their political influence. Okay, the next thing I wanted to ask you about is this idea that AI systems are going to reinforce inequality and bias and social division. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Yeah, absolutely. So I think there's a couple of ways that AI is likely to do that. One is just that these AI systems are built by humans and they reflect the biases of the humans who build them. So if you look at the people who have been building AI at these tech companies, they're overwhelmingly men, and they're overwhelmingly white men, and they're overwhelmingly wealthy white men. And so these AI systems are going to reflect their biases. And we already see evidence of this, right? We have studies showing that AI systems that are used in hiring, for example, often reproduce gender and racial biases. What does that mean? Well, let's say you have a workforce that's 50% women and 50% men, and you train an AI system on that data, but the AI system ends up producing an output where 70% of the people it recommends for hire are men and 30% are women. That's an example of where the AI system is reproducing bias. Another way that AI is likely to contribute to inequality is by automating the types of jobs that are disproportionately done by people of color and women. If we do address the bias in these systems, and if we allow them to continue to automate the types of jobs that disproportionately women and people of color have, then we're going to end up exacerbating existing inequalities. And finally, I think that AI is also likely to increase social division. I think one of the reasons for that is that these AI systems are really good at figuring out how to manipulate our psychology and how to take advantage of our biases. They are really good at getting us to click on things and to share things and to engage with them in ways that reinforce our existing beliefs and that keep us in these sort of echo chambers. And so I think that these systems are likely to be used in ways that exacerbate social division rather than bridge it. Okay, before we go, I just want to mention one last thing that I found really interesting in your reporting, which is this idea that we are actually in a global competition for AI supremacy and that the United States is falling behind. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Yeah, sure. I think that's right. I think we're in a global competition for AI supremacy, and I think the US does face some challenges. One of the things that I talk about in my book is how the US has really been slow to invest in AI compared to other countries like China and the UK and Canada. These countries have figured out ways to make AI a priority. They've invested in research. They've created national strategies. They've created incentives for companies to invest in AI. And the US hasn't done that. In many ways, it is kind of stuck in this mindset that we had during the Cold War, where we thought that just having a free market economy was enough to ensure that we would stay on top, and that hasn't necessarily worked. And so now we face some stiff competition from other countries that have made AI a national priority. And I think that is concerning because AI is one of these technologies that is so fundamental and so foundational that if we fall too far behind, it's really hard to catch up. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Karen. It was really great to have you. Thank you for having me.